Sophia Martinez stared at the man sitting across from her in the dimly lit corner booth of Rosie's all-night diner, his calloused hands wrapped around a coffee mug that had seen better days. He wore a faded flannel shirt rolled up to his elbows, revealing forearms marked with small scars from years of manual labor, and his dark brown eyes held a mixture of confusion and wariness that mirrored exactly what she was feeling. The problem was, she had never seen him before in her life, yet, according to the marriage certificate spread between them on the worn Formica table, next to the salt and pepper shakers and a half-empty bottle of ketchup, he was legally her husband. 6 hours earlier, Sophia had been stocking shelves at Patterson's general store in the tiny mountain town of Willowbrook, Colorado, arranging canned goods with the methodical precision that came from 3 years of the same routine. The afternoon sun streamed through dusty windows, illuminating floating particles that danced in the stale air of the cramped store that served as the town's primary source of groceries, hardware supplies, and local gossip. At 26, she had grown accustomed to her quiet, unremarkable existence. No family to speak of, having aged out of the foster system at 18, no romantic entanglements to complicate her carefully structured days, just honest work that paid enough to cover rent on her studio apartment above the town's only barbershop and kept food on her table. The bell above the door chimed as it always did when customers entered, but this time the sound seemed to carry more weight, more significance, though Sophia wouldn't understand why until much later. The woman who walked in looked as out of place in Willowbrook as a peacock in a chicken coop. She wore an expensive charcoal business suit that probably cost more than Sophia earned in 3 months, carried a leather briefcase that gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and moved with the confident stride of someone who was accustomed to boardrooms and courtrooms rather than small-town general stores that still sold penny candy from glass jars. "Excuse me," the woman said, her voice carrying the crisp diction of someone who'd attended prestigious universities and never had to worry about where her next meal was coming from. "I'm looking for Sophia Martinez." Sophia looked up from the pyramid of soup cans she'd been constructing, wiping her hands on the blue apron that bore the store's faded logo. "That's me. Can I help you find something?" She assumed the woman was lost, maybe looking for directions to one of the ski resorts an hour's drive away, or perhaps she was some kind of inspector from corporate headquarters, though Patterson's was independently owned and had been for 40 years. "My name is Catherine Blackwood from Blackwood, Sterling and Associates. I represent the estate of Harrison Ridge Castellanos, and I have information that will significantly alter your life circumstances." Sophia laughed, a short burst of nervous energy that echoed off the store's tin ceiling. She'd heard similar opening lines from telemarketers and door-to-door salespeople, though none of them had ever worn $1,000 suits or driven the gleaming black Mercedes she could see parked outside. "Ma'am, I think you might have the wrong person. I don't know anyone named Harrison Castellanos, and I'm not involved in any legal matters." But Catherine's expression remained granite serious as she untied the ribbon and opened the folder, revealing documents bearing official seals and signatures. "You are the sole beneficiary of the Copper Canyon Ranch, inherited from Harrison Castellanos, deceased as of 3 weeks ago." The can of tomato soup Sophia had been holding slipped from her fingers, hitting the floor with a metallic clank that seemed to reverberate through the sudden silence. She'd never heard of Harrison Castellanos, never owned anything more valuable than her 10-year-old Honda Civic and the second-hand furniture that filled her modest apartment. The idea that someone would leave her anything, let alone something as substantial as a ranch, seemed impossible. "There has to be some mistake," Sophia said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't have any family. I've been on my own since I was 18. There's no one who would—" "The inheritance is quite substantial," Catherine interrupted, consulting the documents with the same tone she might use to discuss the weather forecast. 12,000 acres of prime grazing and agricultural land, a main house constructed in 1897 and recently renovated, multiple outbuildings including barns, stables, and equipment sheds, approximately 800 head of registered Angus cattle, mineral rights, water rights, and timber rights. Conservative estimates place the total value at approximately $15 million. The words hit Sophia like physical blows. $15 million. She made $9 an hour stocking shelves and organizing inventory. Her biggest financial concern was whether she could afford to replace her car's worn tires before winter. The numbers Catherine was throwing around existed in a different universe from the one Sophia inhabited. "This can't be real," she managed to say, sinking onto the step stool she used to reach the higher shelves. "People like me don't inherit $15 million ranches. There has to be some kind of mistake." Catherine's expression softened slightly, perhaps recognizing the genuine shock and disbelief on Sophia's face. "I understand this is overwhelming, Miss Martinez, but I've verified the documentation multiple times. Harrison Castellanos was very specific in his instructions, and you are definitely the intended beneficiary."
"But I don't understand why. I've never heard his name before in my life." Mr. Castellanos left a letter explaining his reasoning, which I'm authorized to share with you once certain conditions are met. Catherine paused, consulting another set of papers. "However, there is a stipulation that must be addressed immediately to secure the inheritance." Something in the lawyer's tone made Sophia's stomach clench with apprehension. "What kind of stipulation?" Catherine cleared her throat delicately. "The inheritance is contingent upon your immediate marriage to one Lucas Rivera, who has been designated as your intended spouse under the terms of Mr. Castellanos's will." The words hung in the air like smoke, visible but incomprehensible. Sophia stared at Catherine, waiting for the punchline or the revelation that this was some kind of elaborate prank. When neither came, she felt the ground beneath her feet shift in a way that had nothing to do with the old building's settling foundation. "Marriage?" she repeated, the word feeling foreign on her tongue. "To someone I've never met?" "Mr. Rivera is in a similar situation. He received notification of these arrangements this morning and has agreed to meet with you to discuss the situation. The legal ceremony can be performed today if both parties consent." Sophia's mind reeled. 6 hours ago, her biggest concern had been whether Mr. Patterson would approve her request for a 50-cent hourly raise. Now she was being told she could inherit $15 million if she married a complete stranger. It sounded like the plot of a romance novel, not something that happened to orphan store clerks in small Colorado towns. "What happens if I refuse?" she asked. "Then the ranch reverts to the state of Colorado, to be sold at public auction with proceeds going to various charities." Catherine's tone remained professionally neutral. Mr. Castellanos was very clear about this contingency. "And if this Lucas Rivera refuses?" "The same outcome. Both parties must consent or the inheritance is forfeit." Sophia looked around the familiar confines of Patterson's general store, the crooked shelves she straightened every morning, the ancient cash register that required a firm hand to open, the faded linoleum floors she mopped every evening before closing. This had been her world for 3 years, predictable and safe in its limitations. The idea of leaving it for something as fantastical as a $15 million ranch felt like stepping off a cliff into empty air. "Where is this Lucas Rivera now?" she heard herself ask. "He's waiting at Rosie's diner downtown. I arranged for you to meet there in 1 hour." She began organizing her papers with practiced efficiency. "I should mention that time is a factor. The will specifies that if the marriage doesn't take place within 48 hours of both parties being notified, the inheritance clause becomes void." 48 hours. Sophia felt as though she'd been picked up by a tornado and deposited in a different life. This morning she was worried about whether she had enough milk for her coffee. Now she was being asked to make a decision that would alter the fundamental trajectory of her existence. "Can I think about it?" she asked. "Of course, but I do need an answer by tomorrow evening at the latest." She handed her a business card along with a manila envelope. "This contains additional details about the ranch, as well as Mr. Castellanos's letter explaining his motivations. I strongly encourage you to read it before making your decision." After Catherine left, Sophia stood alone in the store, listening to the familiar sounds of Willowbrook's afternoon routine: cars passing on Main Street, The distant sound of children playing in the park, the steady hum of the store's ancient refrigeration units. Everything looked exactly the same as it had an hour ago, but something fundamental had shifted. She felt like an actor who had wandered onto the wrong stage, expected to perform in a play for which she'd never seen the script. She locked up the store early, hanging the "closed due to family emergency" sign in the window. The first time she'd ever claimed to have family, emergency or otherwise. Her apartment above Miller's barbershop felt smaller than usual as she sat on her second-hand couch, reading and rereading the documents Catherine had left. The ranch was real. The photographs showed a sprawling operation nestled in a valley surrounded by snow-capped peaks, with a main house that looked like something from a magazine and outbuildings that spoke of serious agricultural enterprise. The financial statements detailed an operation that turned a healthy profit year after year, managed by a foreman who had worked the land for over 2 decades. But it was Harrison Castellanos' letter that made her hands shake as she read. Dear Sophia, if you are reading this, then I have passed away, and you are learning for the first time about an inheritance that will seem impossible to believe. You do not know me, but I have known about you for your entire life. I was your mother's first love, and though circumstances prevented us from marrying, I never stopped caring about what happened to you or to you. Your mother, Elena Martinez, and I met when we were both 19, working on a ranch in New Mexico. We fell in love with the intensity that only young people can manage, making plans for a future that included marriage, children, and building something lasting together. But my family disapproved of the relationship. Elena was from a poor family, and they had arranged a marriage for me with someone they considered more suitable.
I was weak and chose family obligation over love. Elena disappeared from my life, and I learned years later that she had been pregnant when she left. By the time I tracked her down, she had died in a car accident and you had been placed in the foster system. I tried to gain custody, but my family intervened, convinced that associating with Elena's child would damage our social standing. I have regretted that decision every day since. I built Copper Canyon Ranch thinking about the life Elena and I might have had, the children we might have raised together. When I learned that you had grown up alone, without the support that should have been your birthright, I knew I had to find a way to give you what I had failed to provide when you needed it most. The marriage condition may seem strange, but I have seen too many young people destroyed by sudden wealth. Lucas Rivera is the grandson of my foreman, Miguel Rivera, raised on the ranch and trained in its operation. He is a good man who understands the responsibility that comes with managing something as complex as Copper Canyon. More importantly, he has spent his life preparing to be worthy of inheriting this legacy. I am not asking you to marry for love, but for partnership. You will find that Lucas is honorable, hardworking, and committed to preserving what has been built. Whether your partnership evolves into something deeper is between the two of you. You have every right to refuse this arrangement, but I hope you will consider that this ranch represents not just financial security, but the chance to build something meaningful, to be part of a community, and to have the family you never had. Whatever you decide, know that you carry your mother's strength and her capacity for love. She would be proud of the woman you have become. With deepest respect and regret for lost time, Harrison Ridge Castellanos. Sophia set the letter down with trembling hands, feeling as though she'd been given pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known existed. Her mother, Elena, who had died when Sophia was 2? She'd always wondered about the woman whose name appeared on her birth certificate, but who remained a mystery in every other way. The social workers had told her that her mother was young and unmarried, with no family to take custody. They'd never mentioned a love story, a wealthy rancher who'd spent decades regretting his choices. The emotional weight of the revelation threatened to overwhelm her. All those years in foster care, moving from home to home, aging out of the system at 18 with nothing but a high school diploma and a fierce determination to be self-sufficient. She could have grown up on a ranch, with a father figure who cared about her future, with the security and opportunities that money could provide. But anger warred with the tentative hope that was growing in her chest.
Harrison Castellanos had known about her existence and chosen his family's approval over responsibility to her and her mother? Did his deathbed generosity erase decades of abandonment? As the sun set over Willowbrook, painting the mountains in shades of gold and purple, Sophia made her decision. She would meet Lucas Rivera. She would hear what he had to say, and then she would decide whether to accept an inheritance that came with a husband she'd never met or return to her quiet life stocking shelves and living paycheck to paycheck. She walked the 6 blocks to Rosie's all-night diner, a chrome and vinyl establishment that had served the town's night owls and early risers since the 1950s. The diner was nearly empty at 8 o'clock on a Tuesday evening, just a few truckers nursing coffee and a couple of teenagers sharing a plate of fries. Lucas Rivera sat in a corner booth, and Sophia recognized him immediately, despite never having seen him before. He had the weathered hands and sun-creased eyes of someone who worked outdoors, dark hair that needed a trim, and the kind of solid build that came from physical labor rather than gym memberships. When he looked up and saw her approaching, his expression shifted from apprehension to something that might have been relief. "Sophia Martinez?" he asked as he reached the table. "That's me. You must be Lucas." They shook hands awkwardly, two strangers bound together by the eccentric will of a dead man and the prospect of $15 million. "This is probably the strangest conversation either of us will ever have," Lucas said as they settled into the booth. "I was thinking the same thing. 6 hours ago, the biggest decision I had to make was whether to order more canned corn or green beans for the store. Now I'm apparently married to someone I've never met." "Technically, we're not married yet," Lucas said, and there was something in his tone that suggested he'd given this considerable thought. "The ceremony still has to happen. We both have to say yes." "Have you decided what you want to say?" Lucas was quiet for a long moment, studying her face as though trying to solve a puzzle. "Can I tell you what I know about Ridge Castellanos? Please, because I never heard his name before today. He was my grandfather's best friend, and the finest man I've ever known. When my parents died in a truck accident 15 years ago, Ridge became my guardian. He could have sent me to relatives in Mexico, but instead he raised me on the ranch, taught me everything about cattle, land management, business operations. He paid for my education, supported my decisions, and treated me like the son he never had."
Lucas paused to take a sip of coffee, gathering his thoughts. He never married, never had children of his own, and I always wondered why someone as good and generous as Ridge would choose to be alone. Now I understand. He was carrying regret about your mother, about choices he made when he was young and stupid. Does that excuse abandoning a pregnant woman and letting her child grow up in foster care? No, Lucas said without hesitation. It doesn't. But Ridge spent the last 20 years of his life trying to figure out how to make amends. He hired private investigators to track your life, made sure you were safe and healthy, even anonymously paid for some of your medical expenses when you were a teenager. Sophia stared at him. "What medical expenses?" "You had pneumonia when you were 16 and spent 3 days in the hospital. The bills were mysteriously paid by an anonymous benefactor. Same thing happened when you broke your wrist in a car accident 2 years later." The revelation hit her like a physical blow. She remembered both incidents clearly: the terror of being seriously ill with no family to visit her in the hospital, the stress of worrying about medical bills she couldn't afford to pay. She'd been told both times that a charity had covered the costs, but she'd never questioned the explanation. Was he watching out for me? In the only way he thought he could without disrupting your life. Ridge believed that suddenly appearing and claiming to be your father would cause more harm than good, especially since he couldn't undo the damage his family had caused. Lucas leaned forward, his voice earnest. But he wanted to give you something meaningful, something that would provide security and opportunity. That's what Copper Canyon Ranch represents. And the marriage requirement? Lucas's cheeks reddened slightly. Ridge knew that inheriting that much money could be overwhelming, even dangerous. He'd seen what sudden wealth did to people, how it attracted the wrong kind of attention, how it could isolate someone from genuine relationships. He thought that if you had a partner who understood the responsibility of managing the ranch, someone who could help you navigate that world, you'd be more likely to succeed.
So you're supposed to be my guide to being rich? I'm supposed to be your partner in preserving something Ridge spent 40 years building. Lucas met her eyes directly. But only if that's what you want. If you decide this is all too crazy, I'll respect that decision. The ranch will be sold and we'll both go back to our regular lives. Sophia looked around a diner, taking in the familiar surroundings that had become the backdrop for the most important conversation of her life. Everything she'd ever known suggested that she should walk away from this insane proposition. People didn't inherit ranches from strangers. They didn't marry people they'd met 2 hours ago. They didn't abandon quiet, predictable lives for fairy tale scenarios that sounded too good to be true. But as she studied Lucas Rivera's honest face and thought about her mother's lost love story, about Ridge Castellano's decades of regret, and his attempt to finally do right by Elena's daughter, Sophia felt something stirring in her chest that she hadn't experienced in years. Hope. "Tell me about the ranch," she said quietly. And as Lucas began describing the mountains and meadows, the cattle and horses, the sunrises that painted the valley in impossible colors, Sophia Martinez began to imagine a life she'd never dared to dream possible. "The ranch sits in a valley that's been protected from development for over a century," Lucas continued, his voice taking on a warmth that hadn't been there before. "Ridge's great-grandfather homesteaded the land in 1887, and every generation has added to it, improved it, but never lost sight of what makes it special. When you wake up in the morning, you can see eagles soaring over the peaks, and in the evening, the elk come down from the high country to drink from Copper Creek." Sophia found herself leaning forward, drawn into his description despite her logical mind's protests. "It sounds beautiful, but I don't know anything about ranching. I can barely keep a houseplant alive." Lucas smiled for the first time since she'd sat down, and it transformed his entire face. Reg didn't know anything about ranching when he inherited either. His father expected him to be a lawyer or banker, something respectable in the city. But Ridge fell in love with the land, learned everything he could, and built something extraordinary. "Tell me about the day-to-day reality, because this all sounds like a fairy tale, and I've learned to not trust fairy tales." The honesty in her voice seemed to resonate with Lucas. He set down his coffee cup and leaned back in the booth, considering his words carefully. "It's hard work. The cattle need care year-round, the fences always need mending, and Mother Nature doesn't care about your schedule. Last spring, we had a late blizzard that nearly killed half the newborn calves. Ridge and I spent 3 days straight in the barn bottle-feeding babies and praying we could save them all." "Did you?" "We lost 12. Ridge cried that night. First time I'd ever seen him break down. He'd been ranching for 40 years, but he still felt responsible for every animal in his care." Sophia absorbed this, recognizing something authentic in Lucas's grief. "That's the reality you're asking me to step into?"
Part of it. But there's also the morning when you find a new foal in the pasture, legs still wobbly, learning to run. There's the satisfaction of knowing your cattle are healthy and well-fed, that your land is better this year than it was last year. There's the community of people who depend on the ranch for their livelihoods. Miguel, my grandfather, has been foreman for 23 years. Carmen runs the household and keeps us all fed. Tom and Sarah handled the breeding program. These aren't just employees, they're family. How do they feel about Ridge's plan to marry me off to you? Lucas winced slightly. They're concerned. Miguel thinks Ridge was trying to play matchmaker from beyond the grave. Carmen is worried that you'll sell the ranch to developers who will turn it into a resort. Tom and Sarah are just hoping whoever takes over will let them keep doing the work they love. And you? What do you think Ridge was really trying to accomplish? Lucas was quiet for a long moment, staring out the diner's window at the lights of Willowbrook. I think he was trying to give you the family you never had, while ensuring the ranch would continue to be a place where families could build their lives. He knew I'd never leave Copper Canyon. It's the only home I've ever known, and he believed that if you experienced what it was like to be part of something bigger than yourself, you might choose to stay too. That's a lot of assumptions about a person he'd never met. Ridge had a gift for reading people. He could look at a horse and know whether it would be gentle enough for children to ride or spirited enough for experienced riders. He said people weren't that different.
You just had to pay attention to the right details. Sophia considered this. What details do you think he saw in me? Well, you're still here, Lucas pointed out. Most people would have walked away after hearing about the marriage requirement. The fact that you're asking questions, trying to understand the full picture, that tells me you don't make impulsive decisions. I'm also desperately poor, Sophia said bluntly. $15 million is a powerful motivator, but you haven't said yes yet. If you were just motivated by money, you would have agreed immediately and figured out the details later. Sophia realized he was right. The smart financial move would be to marry Lucas immediately, secure the inheritance, and worry about the complications afterward. The fact that she was still asking questions, still weighing the emotional and ethical implications, suggested that something deeper was driving her consideration. Can I ask you something personal? I think we're past worrying about personal boundaries. Have you ever been in love, really in love, the kind where you can't imagine your life without someone? Lucas's expression grew serious. Yes. Her name was Maria. We met in college, planned to get married after graduation. She wanted me to move to Denver, get a job in finance or real estate, build a life in the city. What happened? I brought her to the ranch for a weekend, thinking she'd fall in love with it the way I had. Instead, she took one look at the isolation, the hard work, the unpredictability, and realized she could never be happy there. She broke up with me 2 weeks later. I'm sorry. Don't be. She was right. Someone who doesn't love the ranch would be miserable trying to live there, and I would have been miserable in Denver. We were incompatible in a fundamental way. And you think I might be compatible? Lucas studied her face carefully. I think you understand what it's like to build something from nothing. You've been supporting yourself since you were 18, working jobs that most people would consider beneath them, but you've done it with dignity. You know the value of hard work and self-reliance. Those are survival skills, not ranch management qualifications. Ridge always said the best ranchers weren't the ones who inherited wealth and privilege. They were the ones who understood that every day was a choice to keep building, keep improving, keep caring for something bigger than themselves. Sophia felt a familiar tightness in her chest, the same feeling she'd experienced as a child when social workers described wonderful families who might want to adopt her, only to be disappointed when the placements didn't work out. Hope was dangerous for people like her, people who'd learned that good things usually came with catches that made them not so good after all. Can we get married and discover we can't stand each other? She asked. Then we get divorced and you keep the ranch anyway. Ridge's will doesn't require us to stay married just to start that way. And you'd be okay with that? Lucas hesitated. I'd be heartbroken to lose the ranch. It's the only home I've ever known, and I can't imagine living anywhere else. But I wouldn't try to trap you in an unhappy marriage just to keep it. The honesty in his voice made something loosen in Sophia's chest. You really love it that much? When I was 15, I broke my leg pretty badly in a riding accident. I was laid up for 3 months, couldn't do any of the physical work that made me feel useful. I got really depressed, started thinking maybe I should take my relatives up on their offer to move to Mexico, start over somewhere else. Lucas paused, lost in the memory. He sat with me one evening on the porch, watching the sunset over the mountains. He didn't say anything for the longest time, just sat there with me. Finally, he pointed to this hawk that was circling overhead and said, "That bird could fly anywhere in the world, but it keeps coming back to this valley. You know why?" "Why?"
The next morning arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that only mountain air could provide. Sophia had barely slept, her mind churning through possibilities and consequences until the pre-dawn light finally gave her permission to stop pretending she might rest. She'd called in sick to Patterson's general store, the first time she'd ever used a personal day for anything more exciting than a doctor's appointment, and now stood outside her apartment building at 7 a.m., clutching a hastily packed overnight bag and watching for Lucas's truck. She'd changed clothes 3 times,
finally settling on jeans, boots, and a practical flannel shirt that seemed appropriate for ranch life while still being the nicest outfit she owned. The morning air carried the scent of pine and the promise of snow from the higher elevations, reminding her that winter in the mountains could arrive without warning and stay until it was good and ready to leave. Lucas pulled up in a navy blue pickup truck that looked well-maintained but thoroughly used, the kind of vehicle that prioritized function over appearance. Through the windshield, she could see that he'd made an effort too. His hair was neatly combed, and he wore a clean button-down shirt under a leather jacket that had seen enough wear to be genuinely comfortable rather than fashionable. "Morning," he said, as she climbed into the passenger seat. "How'd you sleep?" "About as well as you'd expect. I kept wondering if I was making the biggest mistake of my life or missing the opportunity of a lifetime." "Those aren't mutually exclusive possibilities," Lucas said with a rueful smile. "Sometimes the best decisions feel the most terrifying." The truck's interior was clean but clearly belonged to someone who used it for work. Ranch schedules and veterinary contact cards were tucked into the sun visor, and the faint scent of leather and hay permeated the upholstery. As they pulled out of Willowbrook, heading toward mountain roads that Sophia had never traveled, she felt the weight of the decision ahead of her settling into her bones. "How far is the ranch?" she asked. "About 2 hours through the mountains. The last 30 miles are on ranch roads, so it'll get a bit bumpy." He glanced at her sideways. "I should warn you, the isolation is real. In winter, we can get snowed in for days at a time. The nearest neighbor is 12 miles away, and the closest town with more than a gas station is Willowbrook." "Are you trying to scare me off?" "I'm trying to be honest about what you'd be signing up for. City people sometimes romanticize rural life without understanding the practical realities." Sophia considered this as they wound through increasingly spectacular scenery. The road climbed steadily through forests of aspen and pine, past meadows where morning mist clung to the grass that was just beginning to show autumn's golden edges, reminding her that winter in the mountains could arrive without warning and stay until it was good and ready to leave. Lucas pulled up in a navy blue pickup truck that looked well-maintained but thoroughly used, the kind of vehicle that prioritized function over appearance. Through the windshield, she could see that he'd made an effort too. His hair was neatly combed, and he wore a clean button-down shirt under a leather jacket that had seen enough wear to be genuinely comfortable rather than fashionable. "Morning," he said, as she climbed into the passenger seat. "How'd you sleep?" "About as well as you'd expect. I kept wondering if I was making the biggest mistake of my life or missing the opportunity of a lifetime." "Those aren't mutually exclusive possibilities," Lucas said with a rueful smile. "Sometimes the best decisions feel the most terrifying." The truck's interior was clean but clearly belonged to someone who used it for work. Ranch schedules and veterinary contact cards were tucked into the sun visor, and the faint scent of leather and hay permeated the upholstery. As they pulled out of Willowbrook, heading toward mountain roads that Sophia had never traveled, she felt the weight of the decision ahead of her settling into her bones. "How far is the ranch?" she asked. "About 2 hours through the mountains. The last 30 miles are on ranch roads, so it'll get a bit bumpy." He glanced at her sideways. "I should warn you, the isolation is real. In winter, we can get snowed in for days at a time. The nearest neighbor is 12 miles away, and the closest town with more than a gas station is Willowbrook." "Are you trying to scare me off?" "I'm trying to be honest about what you'd be signing up for. City people sometimes romanticize rural life without understanding the practical realities." Sophia considered this as they wound through increasingly spectacular scenery. The road climbed steadily through forests of aspen and pine, past meadows where morning mist clung to grass that was just beginning to show autumn's golden edges. "I've never lived in a city," she said finally. "Willowbrook is the biggest place I've ever called home." "What was it like growing up in foster care?" The question was asked gently, but Sophia still felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with discussing her childhood. "Complicated. I was lucky, never had any truly awful placements, never experienced abuse or serious neglect, but I also never found a family that felt permanent." She watched the landscape roll past, gathering her thoughts. "The hardest part wasn't the moving around or the uncertainty. It was learning not to get too attached to anything, places, people, even possessions, because everything was temporary." "That must have been incredibly lonely." "It was, but it also made me self-reliant in ways that most people my age aren't. When you know you can't count on anyone else to take care of you, you develop skills pretty quickly." Lucas nodded thoughtfully. "Ridge used to say that some of life's greatest strengths come from its greatest challenges. He grew up wealthy but emotionally neglected,
and he always believed that experience taught him to value genuine relationships over social expectations. Is that why he never married? Partly, but also because he never got over your mother. He kept a photograph of her on his desk for 40 years, just a snapshot of her laughing at something, taken when they were both 19. Carmen used to dust around it every week, never asking questions, just accepting that some losses never heal completely. The mention of her mother made Sophia's throat tight with emotion. What else did he tell you about her? That she had the most beautiful laugh he had ever heard, that she could gentle any horse, no matter how spirited, and that she dreamed of having a big family on a ranch where children could grow up with animals and wide open spaces. Lucas's voice grew soft with memory. He said she would have been an amazing mother. I died when I was 2, car accident on an icy road, according to the social workers. I don't remember her at all. Ridge blamed himself for that too. He always wondered if she would have made different choices, been more careful, if she'd had his support instead of facing everything alone. They drove in silence for several miles, both lost in thoughts about decisions made decades ago and their continuing consequences. The road had narrowed to 2 lanes that wound through increasingly dramatic terrain, with drop-offs that revealed valleys stretching toward distant peaks. "Can I ask you something?" Sophia said eventually. "Of course." "Yesterday you mentioned that Ridge hired investigators to keep track of me. What else do you know about my life?" Lucas shifted uncomfortably in the driver's seat. "Probably more than I should. Ridge was thorough when he cared about someone." "Such as?"
I know you graduated high school with a 3.8 GPA despite changing schools 6 times. I know you turned down a partial scholarship to Colorado State because you couldn't afford the remaining costs and didn't want to take on debt. I know you've been working since you were 16, always holding down at least 1 job, sometimes 2. Sophia felt a mixture of violation and wonder. He really was watching out for me. He was proud of you. He used to say that someone who could build a stable life from nothing, who could maintain their integrity while struggling financially, had exactly the kind of character that would honor what he'd built. Or he was romanticizing poverty from the comfort of his wealth. Lucas considered this seriously. Maybe some of both. Ridge had blind spots like anyone else, but he also understood that real character is revealed by how people behave when no one is watching and when there's no immediate reward for doing the right thing. They crested a ridge, and suddenly the landscape opened up before them in a way that made Sophia's breath catch in her throat. The valley below stretched for miles, enclosed by mountains that seemed to touch the sky. A winding river caught the morning light like scattered diamonds, and she could see buildings nestled in the valley floor that looked tiny from this distance, but suggested substantial operations. "Is that it?" she asked. "That's Copper Canyon Ranch," Lucas said, and the pride in his voice was unmistakable. As they descended into the valley, details became clearer. The main house was indeed substantial, a 2-story log and stone structure that managed to look both rustic and elegant, with a wraparound porch that faced the mountains and windows that would capture light throughout the day. Behind it, a complex of barns and outbuildings spoke of serious agricultural enterprise, while pastures stretched toward the tree line where she could see cattle grazing in scattered groups. "It's enormous," Sophia said, trying to process the scale of what she was seeing. 12,000 acres, but only about half of that is usable for grazing. The rest is forest and high country that we use for summer pasture. Lucas pointed to different areas as they drove. The main house sits on about 5 acres, with the working buildings behind it. Employee housing is over there near the equipment sheds. The breeding barn is that big structure to the east. "How many people work here?" "Full-time, about 15 people. Seasonal workers during calving and haying season bring it up to 25 or 30. Lucas pulled into a circular drive in front of the main house, and a man emerged from the house before they'd even stopped. Clearly Miguel, Lucas's grandfather, based on the family resemblance. He was in his 70s, but moved with the easy grace of someone who'd spent his life doing physical work. His weathered face broke into a smile as Lucas climbed out of the truck. "Mi hijo," Miguel said, embracing his grandson warmly, before turning to Sophia with curious but kind eyes.
And you must be Sophia. Welcome to Copper Canyon. Thank you, Sophia said, accepting his offered handshake and noting the calloused strength of his grip. Lucas has told me wonderful things about you. All lies, I'm sure, Miguel said with a grin. But come, Carmen has breakfast ready, and she's been fussing since dawn about making sure everything is perfect. They followed Miguel into the house, and Sophia had to fight to keep her expression neutral as they entered the main living area. The space was gorgeous, high ceilings with exposed beams, a stone fireplace that could heat the entire room, and windows that framed the mountain views like living artwork. The furnishings were comfortable rather than pretentious, with leather sofas that invited lounging and wood tables that showed the patina of decades of use. Ridge always said a house should be lived in, not admired, Lucas said, noticing her expression. Everything here is meant to be used and enjoyed. A woman bustled in from what was obviously the kitchen, wiping her hands on an apron and beaming with the kind of warmth that immediately made Sophia feel welcome. Carmen was probably in her 50s, with graying black hair pulled back in a practical bun and the robust build of someone who'd spent years feeding hard-working people. "So, you're Elena's daughter," Carmen said, studying Sophia's face with obvious emotion. "Dios mío, you have her eyes. Ridge would have been so happy to finally meet you." "You knew my mother?" "I met her once, when she and Ridge were courting. She came to visit for a weekend, and I was just a girl helping my own mother in the kitchen. But I remember her laugh, and the way Ridge looked at her like she was the most precious thing he'd ever seen." Carmen's eyes grew misty with memory. "She helped me gather eggs from the chicken coop, and when one of the hens pecked my hand, she kissed it better and told me that animals can sense when people are afraid, so the secret was to approach them with confidence and kindness. I never forgot that advice." "What else do you remember about her?" "That she loved everything about ranch life. She helped with the morning milking, rode out to check fences with Ridge, even assisted with a difficult calving. Most city girls would have been horrified, but Elena jumped right in. Ridge's father was furious, said she was too common, too enthusiastic about unseemly work. That man never understood what truly mattered. He cared more about social standing than character, more about appearance than substance. Elena had more grace and goodness in her little finger than the woman he forced Ridge to consider marrying. Ridge almost married someone else?
His father arranged an engagement with the daughter of a banking family from Denver. She was everything his parents thought appropriate, wealthy, educated, accomplished in all the proper ways. She also thought ranch life was dirty and primitive, and made it clear that Ridge would need to sell this place and move to the city if he wanted to marry her. Miguel shook his head sadly. Ridge told his father he wouldn't go through with it, that he was going to marry Elena regardless of family approval. That's when his father threatened to disinherit him completely, to cut him off from any family support. "And Ridge chose family obligation over love," Sophia said quietly. "He was 20 years old, scared, and convinced his family knew better than he did," Carmen said gently. "By the time he realized his mistake, Elena had disappeared. He spent months searching for her, finally hired investigators to track her down. But it was too late? She died in that car accident just weeks before he found her location. If he'd looked a little harder, a little sooner—" Miguel's voice trailed off. Lucas squeezed Sophia's shoulder gently. "That's why the ranch meant so much to him. It represented the life he should have had with your mother, the family they should have raised together." Carmen wiped her eyes with her apron. "Enough sad talk. You must be hungry, and I've made enough breakfast to feed a crew of cowboys. Come, sit, eat." The kitchen was the heart of the house, with a massive table that could easily seat 12 people, and windows that looked out over the pastures toward the mountains. Carmen had indeed prepared a feast. Scrambled eggs from their own chickens, bacon from their own pigs, biscuits that were still warm from the oven, and gravy that smelled like heaven. "I don't usually eat this much for breakfast," Sophia said, accepting a plate that Carmen had loaded with generous portions of everything. "Ranch work builds an appetite," Miguel said, "and Carmen believes that good food is how you show love to people."
As they ate, Sophia found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't experienced in years. The conversation flowed easily between Lucas and his grandparents, full of gentle teasing and obvious affection. They discussed ranch business, cattle prices, weather forecasts, equipment maintenance, but also personal matters, family jokes, and shared memories that painted a picture of people who genuinely cared about each other. "Tell me about the operation," Sophia asked. "I understand there are cattle, but what else?" "We run about 800 head of registered Angus, premium breeding stock that we sell to other ranchers, plus commercial cattle for beef production. We also grow hay and grain to feed our own animals and sell the surplus. The mineral rights provide additional income. There's a small natural gas operation on the northern section, and we lease grazing rights to neighbors during certain seasons." "It sounds complex." "Every ranch is a small business," Carmen said. "You have to understand cattle, horses, agriculture, equipment maintenance, veterinary care, market economics, land management, and about a dozen other specialties. That's why Ridge spent so much time training Lucas. This kind of operation requires someone who understands all the moving pieces and how they fit together." After breakfast, Lucas offered to show Sophia around the property. They started with the main barn, a cathedral-like structure with soaring ceilings and stalls for 40 horses. The building smelled of hay and leather and well-cared-for animals, and Sophia was surprised by how peaceful she found the atmosphere. "Do you ride?" Lucas asked as he led her past stalls where curious horses poked their heads out to investigate the newcomers. "I've been on a horse exactly twice, both times at a county fair when I was younger. I wouldn't call that riding." "We'll fix that if you decide to stay. Ridge always said you can't really understand ranch life until you've seen it from horseback." They visited the cattle in the near pastures, and Sophia was struck by how gentle and curious the animals seemed. I'd expected something more intimidating, but these cattle approached the fence line with what looked like friendly interest. "They're beautiful," she said, watching a group of calves play in the morning sunshine. Ridge bred for temperament as much as size and productivity. Calm animals are easier to handle, less likely to injure themselves or the people working with them, and they gain weight more efficiently because they're not stressed. "Everything here seems so thoughtful, like every decision was made with care." That was Ridge's way. He used to say that if you're going to do something, you might as well do it right the first time. They spent the morning touring different aspects of the operation. The equipment sheds with their impressive array of tractors and specialized machinery, the hay barns filled with winter feed, the breeding facilities where prize bulls lived in luxury that rivaled five-star hotels. Everywhere they went, Sophia met employees who clearly loved their work and respected the legacy Ridge had built. Tom and Sarah Wilson managed the breeding program from a small house near the main pastures. They'd been working on the ranch for 8 years, having moved from Texas when Ridge recruited Tom's expertise with artificial insemination and genetic selection. Ridge gave us something most ranch hands never get: real autonomy to make decisions, profit sharing that means we benefit when the ranch does well, and the security of knowing we're building something permanent.
What happens if new ownership decides to change the direction of the operation? Sophia asked. Tom and Sarah exchanged glances. "We're hoping that won't be necessary," Sarah said diplomatically. "This ranch has been profitable for 20 consecutive years. There's no reason to fix what isn't broken." But Sophia could hear the uncertainty beneath their politeness. These people had built their lives around the assumption that Copper Canyon Ranch would continue operating as it always had. Her decision would affect not just her own future, but the livelihoods and homes of 15 families. By afternoon, they'd covered most of the ranch's key operations, and Sophia's head was spinning with information about breeding cycles, market prices, equipment maintenance schedules, and seasonal workflows. The scope of responsibility involved in managing such an operation was both thrilling and terrifying. "Want to see the high country?" Lucas asked as they climbed back into his truck. "There's a spot Ridge loved, about an hour's ride from here. It's where he went when he needed to think through important decisions." They drove through increasingly rugged terrain,
finally parking at a trailhead where horses were waiting, a gentle chestnut mare for Sophia and a sturdy bay gelding for Lucas. After a brief lesson in basic riding techniques, they set off up a winding trail that climbed steadily through forests of aspen and pine. Sophia discovered that while she wasn't a natural rider, the mare seemed to understand her inexperience and compensated accordingly, picking her way carefully over rough ground and responding to her nervous guidance with patient tolerance. "Her name's Honey," Lucas said from slightly ahead on the trail. "Ridge trained her specifically for beginners. She's got more sense than most people I know." The trail emerged from the forest onto a high meadow that took Sophia's breath away. They were surrounded by peaks that seemed close enough to touch, and the valley spread below them like a map of paradise. The ranch buildings looked tiny from this vantage point, but she could see the organized patterns of pastures and roads that spoke of human care and planning. "This is where Ridge proposed to your mother," Lucas said quietly. They dismounted and sat on a fallen log that provided a natural bench overlooking the vista. The silence was profound, broken only by the whisper of wind through grass and the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. "I can see why he loved it here," Sophia said. "He used to say that some places choose you rather than the other way around, that if you're quiet enough, you can feel whether you belong somewhere." Sophia closed her eyes and tried to listen with more than her ears. The sun was warm on her face, the air was clean and thin at this altitude, and she felt a peace that had been absent from her life for as long as she could remember. When she opened her eyes, Lucas was watching her with an expression of careful hope. "What do you think?" he asked. "I think I understand why Ridge believed this place was worth fighting for." She paused, gathering courage for the question that had been building all day. "Lucas, what would happen if I said yes to all of this? The marriage, the ranch, the responsibility, and then discovered I couldn't handle it? What if I'm not strong enough, or smart enough, or capable enough to live up to what Ridge believed about me?" Lucas was quiet for a long moment, studying the valley below them. "Ridge used to tell me that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about being afraid and doing what needs to be done anyway. He said that most of life's best opportunities come disguised as impossible challenges." "That doesn't answer my question. The truth? You might fail. Anyone might. Running a ranch this size is complicated and demanding, and there are no guarantees." Lucas turned to face her directly. "But Ridge spent 40 years building something that could survive mistakes, bad seasons, and learning curves, and you wouldn't be doing it alone. I'd have you. You'd have me, Miguel, Carmen, Tom, Sarah, and everyone else who calls this place home. More than that, you'd have systems and resources and knowledge that Ridge accumulated over decades." Sophia felt the weight of possibility settling around her like a cloak. "And if the partnership, our marriage, doesn't work out personally? Then we figure out how to be good business partners and friends instead of husband and wife. Ridge's will ensures you inherit regardless of our relationship status." "You keep saying that, but I have a hard time believing you'd be okay with losing your home if I decided to sell the ranch." Lucas was quiet for so long that Sophia wondered if she'd offended him. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "I've been preparing for that possibility since Ridge got sick. Miguel and I have been looking at other ranches where we might find work. It would break my heart, but I'd survive." "And you'd really help me walk away if that's what I wanted?" "Sophia, I've loved this place since I was 15 years old, but I've also learned that trying to force someone to stay somewhere they don't want to be is a recipe for misery. If you're not here by choice, really here by choice, then having you won't feel like keeping the ranch. It'll feel like watching it die slowly." The honesty in his voice made my chest tight with emotion. In a single day, this man had shown me more genuine kindness and consideration than I'd experienced in years of relationships with people who claimed to care about me. "I need to ask you something difficult." "Okay."
If there were no inheritance involved, if we'd just met under normal circumstances,
Would you be interested in getting to know me? Or romantically, I mean. Lucas's cheeks reddened, but he didn't look away. Yes, definitely yes. Even though we barely know each other? I know that you ask thoughtful questions and listen to the answers. I know that you're kind to horses and patient with strangers who are trying to help you understand complicated things. I know that you've built a life of dignity and independence, despite circumstances that would have broken a lot of people. He paused. And I know that when you smile, really smile, it makes me want to figure out ways to make it happen again. Sophia felt warmth spread through her chest, a feeling she'd almost forgotten existed. Lucas? Yeah? I want to say yes. His face lit up with hope and relief. Really? I'm terrified, and I have no idea what I'm doing, and there are probably a million ways this could go wrong. She took a deep breath, feeling as though she was stepping off a cliff into empty air. But I've spent my whole life playing it safe, making practical decisions, avoiding risks, and I've ended up alone, barely getting by, with no real connections to anything or anyone. She gestured toward the valley below them. This is the first place I've ever been that feels like it might be home. You're the first person I've met who makes me want to try being brave instead of just being careful. Lucas moved closer on the log, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his brown eyes. Are you sure? Because once we do this, once we get married and you take ownership of the ranch, there's no going back. Your life will never be simple again. My life has never been simple, Sophia said, with a laugh that held no humor. But it's also never been meaningful. Maybe it's time to try something different. Lucas reached for her hand, and she let him take it. His palm was warm and calloused from years of outdoor work, but his touch was gentle. Then let's go home and call Catherine Blackwood. We have a wedding to plan. As they rode back down the mountain toward the ranch, Sophia felt something she'd never experienced before. The sense that she was moving toward something rather than just away from the latest disappointment. For the first time in her adult life, she was choosing hope over fear, possibility over safety. And as the setting sun painted the mountains in shades of gold and purple, Sophia Martinez began to believe that maybe, just maybe, she was finally going home. The wedding ceremony took place 3 days later in the ranch's main living room, with Judge Patricia Moreno officiating, and the entire ranch community serving as witnesses. Sophia wore a simple, cream-colored dress that Carmen had insisted on buying for her during a hurried trip to the nearest city, while Lucas looked handsome but nervous in his best suit, a charcoal gray ensemble that he admitted he'd only worn twice before, both times to funerals. The ceremony itself was brief and surprisingly moving. Judge Moreno, a family friend who had known Ridge for 30 years, spoke about the unusual circumstances that had brought them together, while emphasizing the very real legal and emotional commitments they were making to each other. When Lucas slipped a simple gold band onto Sophia's finger, a ring that had belonged to his grandmother, she felt the weight of more than just jewelry settling onto her hand. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Judge Moreno said with a warm smile. "Lucas, you may kiss your bride." The kiss was gentle, respectful, and lasted exactly long enough to feel genuine without being presumptuous. When they broke apart, Sophia found herself smiling, despite the surreal nature of the situation. 3 days ago, she was a store clerk with no family and no prospects. Now she was married to a man she was still getting to know and legally responsible for a $15 million ranch operation. Carmen had prepared a celebration dinner that could have fed twice their number, and the evening passed in a blur of toasts, laughter, and stories about Ridge's legendary kindness and occasional stubbornness. The ranch hands shared memories of a man who remembered everyone's birthday, who worked alongside his employees during difficult seasons, and who could spot a sick animal from a quarter-mile away. "To Ridge Castellanos," McGill said, raising his glass of champagne as the sun set behind the mountains, "who taught us that the best families are the ones you choose, and that home is what you build with people who share your values.
To Ridge, everyone echoed, and Sophia felt tears prick her eyes as she realized she was now part of something larger than herself for the first time in her adult life. "Are you okay?" Lucas asked as they stood together on the front porch, watching the last of their guests disappear into the gathering darkness. "I think so. It's just a lot to process." She pulled her shawl closer around her shoulders as the mountain air carried its evening chill. "This morning, I woke up as Sophia Martinez, single woman with no family and no significant assets. Tonight, I'm going to sleep as Sophia Rivera, married woman and co-owner of a ranch that employs 15 people. Technically, you're the sole owner. My name isn't on any of the documents." Sophia turned to study his profile in the porch light. "Ridge's will really doesn't give you any legal claim to the ranch?" "None whatsoever. The marriage requirement was about ensuring you had support and guidance, not about giving me ownership rights. Everything here belongs to you now, Sophia. I'm basically your most experienced employee."
That doesn't seem fair. Ridge believed that inherited wealth should come with inherited responsibility. He thought that if I had an easy claim to ownership, I might not work as hard to prove myself worthy of it. Before Sophia could respond, they were interrupted by the sound of an approaching vehicle. Headlights swept across the driveway as a sleek black SUV pulled up to the house, the kind of expensive, intimidating vehicle that seemed designed to announce the importance of its occupants. "Are you expecting anyone?" Sophia asked. "No," Lucas said, and something in his tone made her look at him more closely. His relaxed posture had shifted to alert tension, and his hand moved instinctively to his phone. "Stay behind me." Two men emerged from the SUV, both wearing expensive suits that looked distinctly out of place in the ranch setting. The driver was younger, maybe 35, with the kind of aggressive energy that made Sophia immediately uncomfortable. The passenger was older, perhaps 60, with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to getting his way through intimidation rather than charm. "Mr. Rivera," the older man called out as they approached the porch steps. "Congratulations on your recent marriage. I'm Theodore Blackwood, Catherine's father and senior partner at Blackwood Sterling and Associates." Sophia felt Lucas tense beside her. "Mr. Blackwood, this is an unexpected visit." "I'm sure it is." Theodore's smile was predatory rather than pleasant. "And you must be the famous Sophia. I've heard so much about you." "Have you?" Sophia kept her voice carefully neutral, though something about Theodore's presence set off every alarm bell she developed during years of navigating difficult foster situations. "Oh, yes. It's not every day that someone inherits $15 million from a man they've never met. Quite the fairy tale, really." The younger man stepped forward, his posture aggressive. "I'm Marcus Sterling, junior partner at the firm. We need to discuss some irregularities we've discovered in Ridge Castellanos' will." "What kind of irregularities?" Lucas asked, moving slightly closer to Sophia in a gesture that was both protective and reassuring. Theodore pulled a leather portfolio from his jacket. "It seems there are some questions about the validity of the marriage requirement clause. Our legal review suggests that such conditions may not be enforceable under current Colorado inheritance law." "Your daughter Catherine seemed confident about the legal standing when she arranged the ceremony." "Catherine is young and inexperienced," Theodore replied dismissively. "She may have overlooked certain complications that could affect the inheritance." Marcus opened his own briefcase and withdrew a thick document. "We've prepared alternative arrangements that would be more legally sound. Miss Martinez would receive a cash settlement of $2 million, while the ranch itself would be sold to pay estate taxes and legal fees." $2 million? Sophia couldn't keep the shock out of her voice. From a $15 million inheritance? Estate taxes are substantial, and there are numerous creditors who have claims against the property. After all obligations are met, $2 million represents a generous settlement for someone with no legal training or experience in ranch management. "What creditors?"
Ridge owned this ranch free and clear. He showed me the documentation every year. Financial obligations can be complex, Mr. Rivera. There are equipment loans, livestock mortgages, and various business debts that weren't immediately apparent in the initial estate valuation. That's impossible, Lucas said flatly. I handle the ranch's financial records. There are no outstanding debts beyond normal operating expenses. Marcus smiled with the kind of condescension that made Sophia's teeth clench. With respect, Mr. Rivera, you're a ranch hand, not a financial professional. These matters require expertise that goes beyond feeding cattle and mending fences. I have a degree in agricultural business and 8 years of experience managing this operation's finances. I know exactly what this ranch owes and to whom. Theodore waved dismissively. Regardless, the legal complications make the original inheritance arrangement untenable. Miss Martinez would be wise to accept our settlement offer and avoid the expense and uncertainty of extended litigation. Sophia felt a familiar churning in her stomach, the same feeling she'd experienced as a teenager when social workers had tried to convince her that a particular placement was in her best interest, while obviously serving someone else's agenda. What happens to the ranch if I accept your settlement? It would be sold at auction to satisfy creditors and estate obligations, a clean resolution that protects everyone's interests. Everyone except the 15 families who depend on this place for their livelihoods, Sophia said sharply. Theodore's expression hardened slightly. Sentimental considerations don't change legal realities, my dear. You've been married for less than 6 hours to a man you barely know, inherited a property you have no experience managing, and accepted responsibility for debts you don't understand. The settlement we're offering would allow you to walk away with more money than most people see in a lifetime. And if I refuse,
then you'll find yourself embroiled in legal challenges that could take years to resolve and cost more than the ranch is worth, Marcus said with obvious satisfaction. Inheritance disputes are notoriously expensive and unpredictable. Lucas moved closer to Sophia, his presence both comforting and strengthening. Sophia, you don't have to make any decisions tonight. We can review all the documentation with our own legal counsel before responding to any offers. Actually, time is a factor, Theodore said, consulting his expensive watch. The settlement offer expires at midnight tomorrow. After that, we'll be forced to initiate legal proceedings to protect our clients' interests. Who exactly are your clients? Sophia asked. Various parties with legitimate claims against the estate, Marcus replied evasively. Creditors, business partners, individuals who were excluded from inheritance consideration despite having valid expectations. Something about the way he phrased this made Sophia's suspicions crystallize into certainty. You're representing people who think they should have inherited instead of me. Theodore's smile became razor sharp. There are always questions when someone with no family connection inherits such substantial assets. Courts tend to look favorably on challenges that seek to restore property to its rightful owners. The rightful owner is whoever Ridge Castellanos chose to name in his legally executed will, Lucas said firmly. Assuming that will accurately reflects his final intentions and wasn't influenced by undue pressure or diminished capacity, elder abuse in inheritance matters is unfortunately common. The accusation hung in the air like a slap. Sophia felt her face flush with anger and humiliation. Are you suggesting that I somehow manipulated a man I'd never met into leaving me his ranch? I'm suggesting that the circumstances are unusual enough to warrant judicial review. A young woman with no family connections, no assets, no experience in agriculture or business management, suddenly inheriting millions of dollars from a dying man she'd never met? Any reasonable court would find such arrangements suspicious, especially when the beneficiary is rushed into a marriage with the deceased's protege within days of learning about the inheritance. It suggests a level of coordination and planning that raises questions about everyone's motivations. Sophia felt the ground shifting beneath her feet.
In the space of a few minutes, her fairy tale inheritance had transformed into something that sounded sordid and suspicious when filtered through these men's implications. She could see how a judge unfamiliar with the circumstances might view the situation exactly as Theodore and Marcus were presenting it. However, Theodore continued, his tone becoming magnanimous, accepting our settlement would demonstrate good faith and avoid the unpleasantness of extended litigation. $2 million is more than enough to start a new life anywhere you choose. Away from here, away from responsibilities you're not equipped to handle. Ranch management is incredibly complex, and failure rates among inexperienced owners are notoriously high. We're offering you a chance to profit from this situation without the risk of losing everything to poor decisions or market downturns. Lucas stepped forward, his voice tight with controlled fury. Gentlemen, I think this conversation is over. Mrs. Rivera needs time to consider your offer with proper legal counsel. Of course, Theodore said, though his tone suggested he considered the matter already decided. But remember, the offer expires tomorrow at midnight. After that, everyone's options become significantly more limited and expensive. They turned to leave, but Theodore paused at the top of the porch steps. Oh, and Mrs. Rivera, you might want to ask your new husband about his own legal complications. Mr. Rivera's immigration status has some interesting irregularities that could become problematic if certain government agencies were to receive anonymous tips about potential marriage fraud. The threat was delivered with casual malice that made Sophia's blood run cold. After the men drove away, she and Lucas stood in stunned silence on the porch, processing what had just happened. "Lucas," Sophia said quietly, "what did he mean about your immigration status?" Lucas sank onto the porch steps, his head in his hands. "My parents brought me here from Mexico when I was 13. They died before my legal status was fully resolved. Ridge helped me get temporary protection, but it's complicated." "How complicated?" "The kind of complicated that could result in deportation if someone with enough money and influence decided to make trouble." Lucas looked up at him with anguish in his eyes. "I should have told you before we got married. If they can prove this marriage was arranged primarily to resolve my immigration issues—" "It wasn't, though, was it?" "No, but proving that in court would be difficult, especially if they can present evidence that Ridge arranged the marriage specifically to help me stay in the country." Sophia sat down beside him, her mind racing through implications and possibilities. "Did Ridge know about your status when he wrote the will?" "Yes, he was helping me work through the legal process, but it's slow and expensive. The marriage requirement, I wondered if it was partly meant to help resolve my situation, but I convinced myself it was really about the ranch management. Maybe it was both." They sat in silence for several minutes, watching clouds drift across the star-filled sky. The peaceful beauty of the ranch felt suddenly fragile, threatened by forces they were only beginning to understand.
"Sophia," Lucas said finally, "Theodore Blackwood is right about one thing. You barely know me, and now you're facing legal threats and immigration complications because of our marriage. If you want to take their settlement and walk away, I'll understand. $2 million is a lot of money," Sophia said slowly. "More than you've ever dreamed of having. But it's not what Ridge wanted, and it would mean the end of everything he built. Everything he built will disappear anyway if we can't successfully defend against their legal challenges. At least with the settlement, you'd have financial security." Sophia stood up and walked to the porch railing, looking out over the darkened valley where she could see scattered lights from employee housing. 15 families who'd built their lives around this ranch, who trusted that their hard work would be rewarded with continued employment and security. Miguel and Carmen, who had served Ridge faithfully for decades. Tom and Sarah, who had moved across the country to be part of something meaningful. "Lucas, do you think Ridge knew this would happen? The legal challenges, the threats?" "I think Ridge understood that some people would see his will as an opportunity to challenge and profit. He was careful about legal documentation for exactly that reason. But he still thought it was worth the risk.
He thought you were worth the risk. Sophia turned back to face her husband of 6 hours, this man who had been thrust into her life by circumstances neither of them had chosen, but who had shown her nothing but kindness and respect. "What do you think we should do?" "I think we should fight," Lucas said quietly. "Not because I want to keep the ranch, though I do, but because giving in to bullies and threats is how good people lose everything they care about." "Even if fighting means we might lose everything anyway?" "Even then. Ridge used to say that how you lose matters as much as whether you win. If we're going to lose this place, let's lose it fighting for what's right, not because we were scared into surrendering." Sophia felt something crystallize in her chest, a determination she hadn't experienced since she aged out of foster care and decided to build a life entirely on her own terms. "Then we fight." "Are you sure? Because once we refuse their offer, this becomes a real war. They'll use every weapon they have, legal, financial, personal." "I'm sure." Sophia surprised herself with the strength in her voice. "I've spent my whole life letting other people make decisions about my future. Foster families, social workers, employers, everyone always knew better than I did about what was best for me. I'm done with that." Lucas stood and moved to stand beside her at the railing. "It won't be easy." "Nothing worthwhile ever is." Sophia reached for his hand, finding comfort in the calloused warmth of his palm. "Besides, I didn't survive 18 years in the foster system by giving up when things got difficult." "What's our first step?" "We call Catherine Blackwood and find out if she's really as inexperienced as her father claims, or if there is another reason she's not backing his play." Sophia squeezed Lucas's hand. "Then we start learning everything we need to know about inheritance law, immigration law, and whatever other legal weapons they might use against us. And if we discover that their threats are legitimate, that they really can take the ranch away from us?" Sophia looked out over the valley one more time, thinking about her mother's laughter and Ridge's regrets, about Lucas's quiet strength and the ranch community's trust in their leadership. "Then we make sure this place goes to people who will honor what Ridge built, not destroy it for profit." As they turned to go inside, Sophia felt the weight of her wedding ring on her finger, not just as a symbol of marriage to Lucas, but as a tangible reminder of the commitments she'd made to a life in community she was only beginning to understand. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she was no longer facing them alone. But as they reached the front door, Lucas paused and looked back toward the road where Theodore and Marcus had disappeared. "Sophia, there's something else you should know. Theodore Blackwood isn't just any lawyer. His firm represents some of the biggest development companies in Colorado. If they're involved in this, it's not just about legal fees or estate disputes." "What do you mean?" "I mean, someone wants this land for something specific, something valuable enough to justify an elaborate legal campaign to steal it from its rightful owner." Lucas's expression was grim in the porch light. "And that means our problems are just beginning." Inside the house, Sophia walked through rooms that were now legally hers, past furniture and photographs that represented 40 years of Ridge Castellano's life and dreams. Tomorrow, she would begin the process of learning to defend what he'd left her. Tonight, she would sleep in a bed that had been prepared, in a house that was now her home, married to a man who had become her partner in more ways than either of them had anticipated. As she prepared for bed in the guest room that Carmen had prepared for her, Sophia caught herself in the antique mirror above the dresser. The woman looking back at her wore a gold wedding band and an expression of determined resolve that would have been unrecognizable to the store clerk who had stocked shelves in Willowbrook just 4 days earlier. Change, she realized, didn't always come gradually. Sometimes it arrived all at once, in the form of impossible opportunities and unexpected threats that forced you to discover exactly what you were made of. And Sophia Rivera was about to find out exactly how strong she could be.
Sophia woke before dawn to the sound of Lucas moving quietly through the house.
Through her bedroom window, she could see him in the kitchen, silhouetted against the early morning light as he prepared coffee with the methodical precision of someone trying to impose order on a chaotic situation. She dressed quickly and joined him, finding him staring out the window toward the mountains with an expression of deep concern. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked, accepting the mug of coffee he offered. "Kept thinking about what Theodore said about development companies. If they want this land for something specific, we need to understand what that is before we make any decisions about how to fight them." Sophia settled into the chair across from him at the kitchen table. What could make this particular land so valuable that someone would go to such elaborate lengths to steal it? Several possibilities. Water rights are incredibly valuable in Colorado, especially with the ongoing drought. Mineral rights could mean oil, gas, or precious metals. Or, Lucas paused, looking troubled, there have been rumors for years about a major ski resort development planned for this area. A ski resort? The kind of massive development that would transform the entire valley. Hotels, condos, restaurants, shopping centers. It would be worth hundreds of millions of dollars, but only if developers could acquire enough contiguous land to make the project viable. Sophia felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. And Copper Canyon Ranch would be right in the middle of any such development. The heart of it, actually. The ranch controls the valley floor, the main water sources, and the most accessible routes up the mountain. Without this property, no major development would be possible. They were interrupted by a knock at the front door. Through the window, Sophia could see Catherine Blackwood standing on the porch, looking considerably less composed than she had during their first meeting. Her usually perfect hair was windblown, and her professional attire looked like it had been slept in. "Catherine," Lucas said as he opened the door. "This is unexpected. I'm sorry to come so early, but I needed to speak with you before my father discovers I'm here." Catherine's voice was strained, and Sophia noticed her hands were shaking slightly. "May I come in?" They settled in the living room, where Catherine declined coffee and immediately launched into what sounded like a rehearsed explanation. "I want you to know that I had nothing to do with my father's visit last night. I only learned about it this morning when I saw the file notes in our shared system." "What file notes?" asked Sophia. Catherine pulled a tablet from her briefcase and showed them a document labeled Castellanos Estate Expedited Resolution Strategy. The contents made Sophia's stomach clench with anger as she read Theodore's detailed plan to pressure her into accepting the settlement through a combination of legal intimidation and personal threats. "This is essentially a blueprint for harassment," Sophia said. "It's also legally questionable in several respects. My father is operating under the assumption that you're unsophisticated and easily intimidated. He doesn't expect you to have competent legal representation or to understand your rights." Lucas leaned forward. "Are you offering to represent us?" Catherine hesitated, clearly wrestling with conflicting loyalties. "I can't officially represent you. That would create an impossible conflict of interest with my firm, but I can provide unofficial guidance and point you toward resources that might help." "Why would you do that?" Sophia asked. "Your father seems pretty confident about his legal position." "Because Ridge Castellanos was a client of our firm for 15 years, and he trusted me personally with the details of his estate planning. I know his intentions were genuine, and I know the marriage requirement was legally sound." Catherine's voice grew stronger as she spoke. "More importantly, I know my father's real clients aren't creditors or excluded heirs." "Who are they?" "Pinnacle Development Corporation. They've been quietly buying up land in this area for 3 years, assembling parcels for what they call the Sangre Vista Resort and Recreation Complex. It would be the largest ski resort development in Colorado's history." Sophia and Lucas exchanged glances. "How much of the surrounding land do they already control?" Lucas asked. "Approximately 8,000 acres purchased through various shell companies and intermediaries, but the project isn't viable without Copper Canyon Ranch. This property controls too many key resources: water, access roads, the most accessible routes up the mountain. Without this property, no major development would be possible."
"What would happen to the ranch employees?" she asked. "Construction jobs initially, then service positions in the resort. But the entire character of the area would change. Instead of a working ranch supporting 15 families, you'd have a luxury resort employing hundreds of people seasonally. And generating hundreds of millions in revenue," Lucas added grimly. "Exactly. which is why Pinnacle is willing to spend substantial legal fees to acquire this property through forced sale, rather than negotiating a purchase price that reflects its true development value. Sophia studied the development plans, trying to imagine the peaceful valley filled with ski lifts and vacation condos. "Catherine, what happens if we refuse the settlement and fight this in court?" "Honestly, it depends on several factors: the strength of Ridge's will, your ability to demonstrate competent management of the ranch, and whether Pinnacle can find legitimate grounds to challenge the inheritance." "What about Lucas's immigration status?" Catherine's expression grew troubled. "That's the most serious threat they have. If they can convince an immigration court that your marriage was primarily arranged to resolve Lucas's legal status, it could invalidate the marriage and, by extension, compromise your claim to the ranch. Even though the marriage was Ridge's idea? Proving Ridge's motivations posthumously would be difficult, and immigration courts are notoriously suspicious of marriages that provide convenient solutions to legal problems." Lucas stood and walked to the window, his shoulders tense with frustration. "So we're trapped. Fight the inheritance challenge and risk losing on immigration grounds, accept the settlement and watch the ranch be destroyed for profit." "There might be a third option," Catherine said quietly. "Which is?" "You could file a preemptive lawsuit challenging Pinnacle's land acquisition strategy. If you can prove they've been using fraudulent methods to assemble parcels, shell companies, misrepresented intentions, pressure tactics against other landowners, you might be able to tie up their entire project in litigation." Sophia felt a spark of hope. "That would give us leverage, potentially, but it would also escalate the conflict significantly. Pinnacle has deep pockets and experienced legal teams. They don't lose often." "What would we need to pursue that strategy?" Catherine consulted her tablet again. Evidence of fraudulent land acquisition practices, documentation of pressure tactics against other landowners, proof that their environmental impact assessments were deliberately misleading, and legal representation with experience in complex development disputes. "Do you know lawyers who handle that kind of case?" "I know someone who might help. Jessica Chen, no relation to me. She's a former prosecutor who now specializes in white-collar defense and complex civil litigation. She's handled several cases involving questionable development practices." Lucas turned back from the window. "Would she take a case like this?" "Jessica has a particular interest in cases where large corporations use legal intimidation against individuals. She might take it on contingency if she believes you have a strong case." "What does contingency mean?" Sophia asked. "She'd cover the legal costs up front and take payment from any settlement or judgment you win. If you lose, you don't pay attorney fees, though you might be responsible for court costs." It sounded too good to be true, which made Sophia immediately suspicious. "What's the catch?" "Contingency lawyers are selective of their cases because they only get paid if they win. Jessica would need to be convinced that you have a realistic chance of success and that any eventual settlement would be large enough to justify her investment of time and resources." Sophia looked at Lucas, who nodded slightly. "Can you arrange a meeting?" "I can try, but there's something else you need to know." Catherine's expression grew even more serious. "My father is planning to file formal inheritance challenges tomorrow if you don't accept the settlement. Once those proceedings begin, everything becomes much more complicated and public." "Public how?" "Court filings become public record. Local media might pick up the story of a mysterious inheritance and suspicious marriage. That kind of attention could bring additional scrutiny to Lucas's immigration status and your personal backgrounds." The implications were daunting. Sophia had spent her entire adult life maintaining privacy about her foster care background. The idea of having her personal history dissected in public proceedings made her feel physically ill. "How long do we have to decide?" Lucas asked. "Jessica could meet with you this afternoon if she's available, but you'd need to file any preemptive lawsuit by end of business today to stay ahead of my father's timeline. After Catherine left, Sophia and Lucas spent an hour calling ranch employees to explain the situation and gauge their willingness to support a legal fight that could put their jobs at risk. The conversations were difficult, but illuminating. Miguel was bluntly supportive. Ridge didn't spend 40 years building this place so it could be turned into a playground for rich tourists. We fight. Carmen was more emotional. This ranch has been home to 3 generations of my family. If we have to fight to protect it, then we fight. Tom and Sarah were practical. We've got marketable skills and could find work elsewhere if necessary, but we believe in what this place represents. If there's a chance to save it, we want to help. The unanimous support from people who had the most to lose gave Sophia confidence to proceed with Catherine's suggested strategy. At 2 o'clock that afternoon, she and Lucas drove to Denver to meet with Jessica Chen.
Jessica's office was located in a converted warehouse in the Yards District, with exposed brick walls and floor-to-ceiling windows that flooded the space with natural light. Jessica herself was younger than Sophia had expected, maybe 35, with short black hair and the kind of intense energy that suggested she thrived on challenging cases. "Catherine gave me a preliminary briefing on your situation," Jessica said, as they settled into comfortable chairs around a conference table covered with legal documents and case files. "But I want to hear the story from your perspective." Sophia found herself telling the entire tale, from her ordinary life in Willowbrook through the inheritance announcement, the ranch visit, the wedding, and Theodore Blackwood's threats. Jessica listened without interruption, occasionally making notes, but mostly focusing intently on every detail. "Catherine gave me a preliminary briefing on your situation," Jessica said, as they settled into comfortable chairs around a conference table covered with legal documents and case files. "But I want to hear the story from your perspective." Sophia found herself telling the entire tale, from her ordinary life in Willowbrook through the inheritance announcement, the ranch visit, the wedding, and Theodore Blackwood's threats. Jessica listened without interruption, occasionally making notes, but mostly focusing intently on every detail. "Catherine was right about the development angle," Jessica said, when Sophia finished. "I've been tracking Pinnacle development for 2 years. They've used similar tactics in at least 3 other locations: shell companies, pressure tactics, legal intimidation of property owners who won't sell." "Have you been able to stop them before?" Lucas asked. "Once. In Summit County, we proved they'd misrepresented their environmental impact assessments and used fraudulent appraisals to pressure elderly landowners into selling below market value. The county revoked their development permits and fined them $12 million. What happened to the land? It became a county park. The original landowners got market value compensation, and the community preserved the area's character." Sophia felt a surge of hope. Could something similar work here? Potentially, but every situation is different, and Pinnacle has learned from their previous losses. They're more careful now about documentation and legal exposure. Jessica stood and walked to a whiteboard covered with diagrams and case notes. "Here's what I think we're dealing with. Pinnacle needs your ranch to complete their land assembly. Without it, their entire project collapses, and they've already invested tens of millions in acquiring surrounding properties." "So they're desperate," Lucas observed. "Desperate enough to pay substantial legal fees to force a sale rather than negotiate a price point that reflects the property's true development value." Jessica turned back to face them. "The question is whether we can prove they've used illegal methods to pressure you into selling." "Theodore's threats last night certainly felt illegal," Sophia said. "They were ethically questionable, but probably not technically illegal. Lawyers are allowed to be aggressive advocates for their clients, even when that advocacy feels like harassment." "What about the immigration threats?" Jessica's expression grew serious. "That's more promising. If we can prove that Pinnacle instructed Theodore to use Lucas's immigration status as leverage, that could constitute illegal coercion." "How would we prove that?" "Internal communications, billing records, witness testimony. Corporate clients usually document their legal strategies extensively for billing and liability purposes." Lucas leaned forward.
What would you need from us to pursue this case? Complete transparency about your backgrounds, your relationship, and your motivations for the marriage. If we're going to argue that you're the legitimate inheritors acting in good faith, I need to know everything that opposing counsel might use against you. Sophia felt her chest tighten. How complete is complete? Every detail of your foster care history, your financial situation, your employment record. Every aspect of Lucas's immigration status and family history. Every conversation you had with Ridge or his representatives. Every document, every witness, every potential vulnerability. And then? Then I'll spend the next 6 hours reviewing documents and making phone calls to determine whether we have a case worth filing. Jessica's expression was frank. I'll be honest with you. Contingency cases are a significant financial risk for me. I only take them when I believe we can win and when the potential recovery justifies the investment. What do you think our chances are? Lucas asked. Based on what I've heard so far, maybe 60-40 in your favor, assuming we can develop solid evidence of Pinnacle's misconduct. Those aren't terrible odds, but they're not great either. Sophia and Lucas spent the next 3 hours providing Jessica with every detail they could remember, every document they had access to, and contact information for every potential witness. The process was exhausting and occasionally humiliating, particularly when Jessica pressed Sophia for specifics about her financial desperation and Lucas about his immigration vulnerabilities. I know this feels invasive, Jessica said during a brief break, but opposing counsel will dig into these same details with the specific goal of using them against you. Better that we identify potential problems now and develop strategies to address them. By 6 o'clock, Jessica had compiled a file that probably contained more information about Sophia and Lucas's lives than either of them had ever shared with another person. As they prepared to leave, Jessica made them a proposition that would change everything. I'm going to take your case, but I need you to understand what you're signing up for. This won't be a quick resolution. We're talking about months of litigation, extensive discovery, media attention, and personal scrutiny that will be uncomfortable at best.
But you think we can win? I think we can expose enough of Pinnacle's misconduct to force a settlement that protects the ranch and provides you with sufficient resources to manage it successfully. Jessica paused. More importantly, I think Ridge Castellanos was right about your character. You've both demonstrated integrity and courage in a situation that would have broken most people. What's our first step? I filed a federal lawsuit tomorrow morning alleging conspiracy to defraud, illegal coercion, and violation of various consumer protection statutes. That will freeze Pinnacle's timeline and force them to respond to our allegations rather than pursuing their intimidation strategy. And then we gather evidence, take depositions, and build a case that demonstrates Pinnacle's pattern of misconduct. If we do our job well, they'll eventually decide that settling with you is less expensive than continuing to fight. As they drove back toward the ranch through the gathering darkness, Sophia found herself thinking about the decision they'd just made. In the space of a week, she'd gone from stocking shelves for $9 an hour to filing federal lawsuits against major corporations. The transformation felt surreal, but also strangely inevitable. "Are you okay with this?" she asked Lucas as they navigated the winding mountain roads. "Scared but determined. How about you?" "The same, but also—" Sophia paused, searching for the right words. "For the first time in my adult life, I feel like I'm fighting for something that matters instead of just fighting to survive. Ridge would be proud of you. Ridge would be proud of both of us." They reached the ranch after midnight, exhausted but oddly energized by the day's developments. As they stood together on the front porch, looking out over the darkened valley that was now legally theirs to protect, Sophia felt a sense of purpose that she'd never experienced before. "Lucas, whatever happens with the lawsuit, whatever challenges we face, I want you to know that I don't regret any of this. Not the inheritance, not the marriage, not the decision to fight. Even if we lose everything, even then, because for the first time in my adult life, I'm part of something bigger than myself.
I have a family, a home, a community that depends on me. That's worth fighting for regardless of the outcome." Lucas reached for her hand, and she let him take it. "Then let's make sure we win." As they headed inside, Sophia caught sight of herself in the hallway mirror, the same mirror where she'd seen her determined reflection just days earlier. The woman looking back at her now wore the expression of someone who had chosen her battles and was prepared to see them through to the end. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new threats, and new tests of her resolve. But tonight she was home, surrounded by people who had chosen to trust her with their futures, married to a man who had shown her partnership could mean strength rather than compromise. And for the first time since learning about her impossible inheritance, Sofia Rivera felt ready for whatever came next.